everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Green Jeans. I am your one co-host, Annika Van Rossum, using pronouns she, her, and I'm joined by my other co-host,
Maya Van Rossum, also going by pronouns she, her, and I happen to be the mother of the Annika.
You took away my part that I always say. Well, like, and if you couldn't tell by our last names, we are related. But that's fine. Different intro this week, I guess. Whatever. Steal my thunder.
I like to claim ownership of you, man. I really appreciate you. And I just wanted to claim my territory first. Not that you're my territory, but I am proud to be your mother.
Well, I'm proud to have you as my mother. You are my favorite bragging point, and it is honestly, it's my favorite thing now that most people are like, I know so much about your mom because you talk about her all the time. And I'm like, yes, that's how it should be.
That is so nice. That is so nice.
Yeah. So the other part of the intro is that we talk about generational, social and environment. See, messed up my whole thing. Social and environmental justice issues through a generational lens, because I am somehow so many years later fighting the same battles my mom was fighting when she was a young activist. So, ta-da!
Wait a second.
What?
When she was a young activist?
Okay, I have a flow. I have a specific flow about how I do the intro.
I am still a young activist, man. I am young at heart.
All right, well, I just want you to know that I have a specific flow and you don't have a problem with my intro the way I do it. And then you messed it up. So my brain went and it went weird.
And you just forgot how young I am. That's okay.
Yeah.
I will let you off the hook. So, Annika, we are going to be joined today by a really incredible lady, and she's going to come on and she's going to set up our topic with the hot news of the week, which is actually, frankly, pretty big hot news if you care about something called PFAS. And then she's going to set it all up for us, tell us the hot news, and then she's going to rush off to another meeting, and you and I are going to explore further what is happening with PFAS in the modern world. Exciting. That is a setup, isn't it? Isn't that exciting?
That's a good setup. I will say, for anyone who's like, this sounds like it's going to be a dry episode, it actually won't be, and you should pay a lot of attention, because PFAS is what, if I said 9 times out of 10, 95% of the time probably in your life right now, to people listening. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, well, I don't want to steal. So first off, who we're going to hear from, her name's Tracy Carluccio, and she's the deputy director of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And she and I work very closely together on many, many issues. And she has really been lead for the Delaware Riverkeeper Network on this issue of PFAS for an incredibly long time. And really at this point is, a national expert and responsible for really powerful advancement when it comes to PFAS protection, in not just in the Delaware River watershed, but frankly in the nation, because of the things that she's accomplished with such strong, powerful, progressive protections that wouldn't have existed but for her work and supported by the work of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. So it's super exciting. She's going to lay it out, and then you and I are going to explore further.
Hi, Tracy. Welcome to our Green Jeans podcast. We're super excited to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me to join you today, Annika and Maya.
I know Annika gets prime billing in your heart. I get it, man.
Yes, she does. I must admit.
But we just, have just had a good time really singing your praises about how through your work within the Delaware River watershed state starting years ago, you have not only secured powerful progress for our state, but you have really set a really important bar for other states across the nation. And at this point are truly a leading expert on today's topic, which is PFAS. And so Annika, I think, is going to start with the first question, Tracy, so you can help us set the stage for this really important discussion and the hot news of the week.
So I think I was saying to Mom earlier that I think when people first hear PFAS, it sounds like, I don't know what this is. This is going to be really technical and boring, and I don't want to listen to it. So if you could, I guess, lay out what it is and how actually it's like affects pretty much almost everybody in the nation in ways that they probably don't even realize.
That's right. You're exactly right, Annika. So PFAS compounds are a group of man-made chemicals that were used really beginning several decades ago, and they're still in use today. There's been a lot of controversy over the control of these highly toxic compounds, and the bottom line is that the federal government has done very little, and as a result, states and in many instances, independent scientists, attorneys like Rob Bilott had to push this issue up into the face of the public and into the face of regulators. But basically, these compounds are fluorinated compounds. They have very strong bonds. And the thing that makes them attractive for manufacturing and in different plastics is that they don't break down easily. So that property allows them to be put on things like upholstery and rugs and as waterproofing. They're used as non-stick coatings, even in bags that your French fries come in at a fast food restaurant, or maybe the inside of a drink cup. They're put in cosmetics in order to help with the application of these supposedly of these various cosmetics. So they're really in everybody's lives in a lot of ways that we would never think about. Teflon, Kevlar, even your dental floss is probably containing PFAS compounds or what they call replacements or new substitutions for the original PFAS compounds. So that they have been found in the blood of every American at about a level of 3. And to put that into perspective, that means that it occurs in our bodies, in our blood, at levels that can actually harm our health. And it's also in wildlife. They've found it in polar bears, for instance. They've found it in all sorts of wildlife. In the Delaware Bay, for instance, it's found in dolphins. And there's not a whole lot of studies on this, but what has come out of the advanced ways that PFAS are being sampled for is that it's even in the fish that people eat. That's why Delaware Riverkeeper Network has issued a fish consumption advisory, and also New Jersey and Pennsylvania also did. But our fish advisory makes it very clear that it's dangerous to eat these fish at all. And there are actually do not eat orders that have been put out, for instance, for the Neshaminy Creek for fish caught there in Pennsylvania. So that's sort of the big picture of what these are and how they've been used and how they have, like, insinuated themselves through manufacturing and the use of firefighting foams into our environment and then into our bodies.
So Tracy, a lot of bad things we hear about in the world, industry will come back, contaminants that at high levels can be harmful or sometimes low levels. And industry comes back and say, well, that's a naturally occurring substance. Is that what PFAS is?
No, it's a man-made chemical. It's a chemical that was manufactured by DuPont and 3M. And they began this back when they first started studying it in the 50s. It went into products as early as the 60s. And it was actually used, the original PFAS, what they call long chain. That's how many carbons are in a chain. Those are the most powerful PFAS compounds. It was actually used right up to when they were all supposed to be phased out around 2010, but 2015 was actually the deadline on that. But what has happened as a result of these chemicals that were manufactured by these companies is that they made their way into other products, and such as firefighting foams that were used by the military, and that's one of the sources of one of the greatest sources of contamination of drinking water is through that, but also all across the globe. This is an international issue because different companies picked this up and have contaminated drinking water and the environment all across the globe with PFAS.
I know there's that's insane. I remember like a few years ago I watched, actually there's a Netflix documentary called The Devil We Know, and it's about like when you buy nonstick cookware and 3M, and about PFOAs, and they did like a study, to the class action did a study, and the only blood they found of people with none of this in their body was, I guess, like, I don't know why this blood was saved, but it was blood from people who went off to the Korean War and got their blood taken before they went. So it was like so many years later. And I know in that documentary, they talk a lot about the health effects of people, but like through your work and what,
Mhm.
everything you've been doing, what have you seen how this like affects people?
Yes, that's right. And Annika, I think, what has happened as this issue has come to light is that it really has been the effects on people's health that has made that happen. And Rob Bilott, who is, our hero, because he broke this issue when he found it in waste from DuPont, um, really, set the ball rolling. So there were human health studies and blood studies that were done down in West Virginia and Ohio, and they found that there are diseases that are correlated with PFAS compounds through those studies. It still took a long time, more than a decade, to actually get any kind of regulatory attention to this issue. And the EPA hasn't even taken the final steps they should have taken 20 years ago. But the important thing here is that there are known diseases such as kidney cancer, there's thyroid conditions, bladder cancer. It affects the metabolism of people so that you have higher hypertension incidences amongst people who have been exposed. And every amount of PFAS compounds that you drink in through your drinking water magnifies at about 105 times in your blood. It's bioaccumulative. So what that means is that you've got this stuff in your blood. It's very difficult for the body to excrete it. So every drop of water that's contaminated that you drink increases the risk of you developing a disease because of the presence of this toxic compound in your body. And this is one of the most frightening, really terrorizing aspects of PFAS compounds, because once you get it in your body, it's very difficult to get rid of, and it builds up. And that's part of, what they commercially advertised it as, something that is very strong and won't break down. Well, what does that mean for the environment and for people? It means disaster. And communities all across the United States, and like I said, internationally as well, have developed health conditions, and some of it, very serious diseases that are fatal because of this. One last thing that's really important and very startling about the impacts of PFAS compounds is that some of them, such as PFOA and PFOS, have effects on the development of a fetus and an infant. And because infants drink more water than adults do per body weight, what that means is that infants are getting a bigger dose, and they're even more vulnerable than an adult, for instance, a healthy adult, to the effects of PFAS in their blood. How can we possibly be exposing fetuses to developmental defects that are going to mark them for life? Through the umbilical cord of the mother. There's no way to stop it. It can't be stopped. So uh, women of childbearing age need to be very careful about where they get their water, and how much that they're exposed to through other sources like cosmetics, because it builds up in your body and you don't even know it, and then you affect, if you are having a child, you affect that child, and it could be for life.
Oh my gosh, Tracy. So this is horrifying stuff. This is a horrifying chemical made by companies who got big profits off of its use. And now clearly, based on what you're saying, we know, the government knows, science knows, everybody knows that this chemical has serious ramifications for human health and for the environment. So tell us about all the really powerful ways that the state governments and the federal government have been taking action to protect us.
Okay, so the federal government, not so much. The federal government, unfortunately, has not adopted a new maximum contaminant level. That's a safe drinking water standard that they issue for toxic compounds that can have health effects since the late 1990s. So they are really out to lunch throughout all administrations in addressing toxic compounds that get into our bodies and make us sick. And then we start wondering, well, why is there such high cancer rates? So um, because the federal government hasn't done their due diligence, that they haven't taken action, and they knew about this very early on. They knew about this according to file requests long before anybody else knew about it decades ago. And because they didn't do it, some states have stepped up and taken action in order to require the removal of PFAS compounds from drinking water. And that because drinking water is the greatest route of exposure for human beings is a very powerful action. Now, very few states have done this. There's 7 or 8 that have actually taken regulatory action. Not all of them have mandatory safe drinking water standards, but New Jersey does, for instance. New York does. In the Delaware River watershed, those 2 states were actually leaders, particularly New Jersey, which was the first state to adopt any MCL or safe drinking water standard for any PFAS compound in the entire nation. So they were really leading the way. And then New York came next. And now finally, after a lot of advocacy on the part of the public, residents of Pennsylvania, and Delaware Riverkeeper Network, the Pennsylvania has proposed and is in the midst of the proposed rulemaking to set maximum contaminant levels or safe drinking water standards for just 2, PFOA and PFOS, and so is Delaware. So, there are states that are stepping up because they have to do something. The public is telling them we want to be protected. And so that's why there is action that has been happening. It's really come up from the bottom up in New Jersey, for instance. It really came up from residents and municipalities speaking up, and from nonprofits, particularly Delaware Riverkeeper Network, who discovered the presence of PFAS in New Jersey and brought it to the attention of the authorities as well as the residents. But I think this great action that we would all think that everybody would be jumping to has taken an excruciatingly long time. It's been so frustrating for the public, particularly if you are already experiencing health issues. And there are people in Bucks and Montgomery County who are drinking water for decades because of the 3 military bases they're using firefighting foam and not stopping its spread into the environment at all, who have children who have cancer and who have had early deaths in their family, who have suffered lifelong health effects. And right now, finally, the federal government, through the Centers for Disease Control, is starting to do the study we need to have done, which is blood studies that we and residents have been screaming for over a decade. They're finally doing these studies, and there are 6 of them across the United States, and one of them is in Bucks and Montgomery County, and another one is in Paulsboro, New Jersey. And that has a lot to do with our discovery and expose of PFNA, one of the most highly toxic PFAS compounds in the water in Delaware River towns centered in Paulsboro. But this is a very important step because the science on, how much actually triggers a health effect in your blood, how long does it actually stay in your body? What can you do to quickly, to speed up its exit from your body? All of these questions and the education of health professionals are, now this next important step that needs to be taken at the federal and the state level, but mainly by, health agencies.
I just always think it's so interesting, especially you talking about how it affects fetuses, because obviously like the government has been very focused on taking away women's rights to their bodies to protect a fetus, but we're not doing anything to like, oh, here's this highly toxic chemical that women are ingesting all the time and creating an unhealthy baby that if they want to carry it to term, and nobody's doing anything on that level to protect it. But I think it's so interesting you talking about how like people are getting involved. There's all this study now to get doctors involved, but how can people, I think it would be great to find ways to expel it from our bodies, but obviously we want the state to like stop it first. If you have thoughts on like how people can get involved.
Right. Well, people have been involved, and that's really the only way that state regulations have been adopted, by people being involved. And basically going to your municipality before there were any regulations in place, for instance, in New Jersey, and saying, you've got to do something, you've got to get this out of our water. And both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the communities themselves actually pushed their water companies, and when it's an authority that's owned by the local government, their authorities, to proactively remove PFAS compounds, at least the ones that are the most prevalent, PFOA and PFOS, and in some cases PFNA, from drinking water by putting in carbon filtration and reverse osmosis treatment. Different resins are used, but also by closing down wells that really couldn't be renovated, that were just totally contaminated, and replacing it with water that was PFAS free. So there really has been action to remove PFAS compounds from drinking water, even before regulatory efforts, because people stood up and said to their town fathers and mothers, we want this stuff out of our water. We didn't put it here. It was put here by companies that made a lot of money off it. We want it removed from our drinking water, number one. And of course, Annika, the thing that follows from that is you got to get it out of drinking water. That is an absolute, ethical imperative. But the second thing is that then you've got to get it out of the environment and need to stop its movement into the environment, because you're always digging yourself out of a hole that you can't get, to the bottom of, if you're continuing to have it move into our environment. And one of the insidious things about PFAS compounds is that even places that don't use them anymore, it's still leaving that contamination source because it doesn't break down in the environment. So, I mean, they've found that biosolids, for instance, put on farm fields in Vermont 20 years ago are still there, and were found at such levels that a dairy farmer up there had to destroy all of his cattle. So we're talking about extremely long-lived, that's why they call them forever chemicals, that even if you stop using it, it's in the environment. So what they need to do is go to the source, pinpoint all those sources, and then they need to filter it out, and then they need to destroy it in a way that does not spread it further into the environment. There are technologies that are being developed to do that, but there's also some, like the military's burning it, for instance, which means that it transforms it into an air pollutant. And PFAS compounds do move through the environment through a lot of environmental media, groundwater, surface water, soils, air. And that's one of the problems, is that you have to be extreme. You have to treat this like most highly toxic materials that we know of on Earth. Like radium 226, or spent fuel from a nuclear reactor has to go to a special place. And that's not what's happening now. It has not been reclassified as a hazardous substance by the federal government or any state government. So we need a lot more action on this in order to actually get a handle on the pollution sources and removing it from the environment. But that is the, sort of the other really important thing that you have to do at the same time. Unfortunately, companies like DuPont, 3M, Solvay, the military themselves have put us in an untenable situation as public. And we're now left with having to do everything at once, push everything at once in order to stop this pollution of our bodies and our environment. The responsible parties should be paying for this, for instance, and yet, states like New Jersey have sued these companies in order to get action. They've sued the Department of Defense in order to get the military to take action. And this is unconscionable. That means taxpayers are paying again. We're paying with our bodies, we're paying with our environment, and then we're paying for making action happen by these responsible parties, or what you'd call irresponsible parties, but those who are responsible and are not stepping up to be accountable for polluting our environment and our bodies.
So Tracy, there, as I understand it, well, as we know, there is hot news of the week. So there, as you said, these chemicals are still being used in some places, in some spaces. They're still in the environment. They're still in people's bodies. States are starting to step up. Historically, the federal government has not been there, but there has been some good news, hot news of the week. Can you share that with us?
Right. Yes, there has been a development. When the Biden administration, actually, when President Biden was running for office, he promised to do something about PFAS. And when the Biden administration came in, they did actually start to look at it in a much more serious and deliberate, intentional way than any prior administration had. And as a result of that, they came out with a roadmap last year, and everybody kind of rolled their eyes. Okay, we've seen a lot of these roadmaps out of EPA about how they were going to eventually regulate this chemical. But I have to say that this week, the EPA announced an action where they have actually made more strict the health advisory levels that are given out federally for PFOA, PFOS, and then also for two of what they call the replacement chemicals for PFAS compounds, the Gen X chemical group, and also PFBS. So these chemicals now, for instance, PFOA and PFOS, health advisory level from the EPA for several years has been 70 parts per trillion, either measured on their own or in combination. And now they are reduced greatly to 0.0004 parts per trillion. Now that sounds really low, and it is. And actually, it's so low that you can't measure it. I mean, labs can't measure it that low. So what this new health advisory is actually saying is that in order, and this is PFOA, that's the lowest. The PFOS is also low, 0.02 parts per trillion, also so low you can't measure it. But what it's saying is that any level that you can detect in water is dangerous to human health. And they base that on human health studies. Now, most risk assessments that are done to develop safe drinking water standards are based on animal studies, but there was enough human studies as a result really of Rob Ballard's work and then follow-up work that's happened, since the PFAS compounds became more known as a result of monitoring done by the EPA. And those, now we're in a situation where these very low levels are acknowledged as being dangerous, and we can't. There's the one thing that this does, even though it's only a health advisory level, it's not mandatory, and we need to make it mandatory. What it does is it says to everybody, there's no debate anymore. These compounds are so toxic that if you can measure them in your water, if you can measure them in your soil and your environment, then you've got to get them out because they're going to harm people and the environment. So that's really the most important message here, is that the EPA has backed up with science the fact that these PFAS, the 4 compounds that they have taken this action on, are highly dangerous. They're amongst the most dangerous chemicals on Earth. And the other thing that's, I think, very important to realize, though, is that this is an interim step. They said it could be changed. And once they do their quote unquote cost benefit analysis, or what they call cost analysis, these numbers could drastically go up. And that has happened in states like Pennsylvania, where they have a goal based on health, and then they apply the cost analysis, and then the numbers get less strict. So we don't really know what the final numbers are going to be that come out of the EPA. They say they're going to be doing it by next year. We don't know if that's really true. People are jaded because they've been promising this forever. But I think, the important thing is that these health advisory levels are used by states and the military as guidance about when they have to take action. So it will trigger actions that have not happened before. As a matter of fact, I imagine the the earth moved beneath the feet of the Department of Defense when they saw this. And that's a good thing because they need to be shaken up.
You're muted, Mom.
Tracy, thank you so much for coming on with us today and bringing us up to speed on what PFAS is, what it does, and where we might be going to address this situation. And thank you for your leadership on this important issue. You're fabulous.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Annika and Maya, very much for inviting me and Delaware Riverkeeper Network to join you today. It was fun. Thanks.
It was awesome.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
So Annika, I mean, you made such an important point during, our conversation with Tracy, which is that there's all this focus on not allowing people to control their own bodies, not being able to have an abortion, potentially not even being able to use birth control from what we're hearing, right? Forcing the creation of more and more babies. And yet, this is just another example, as you so well pointed out, that it's about making the babies be born, not making sure they're born healthy or that they have good quality, healthy lives. Quite a shock. I mean, everything she said is shocking.
I agree. I mean, I'm just kind of over, like, literally last night when before I went to bed, I saw a clip and it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. And she's like talking about how climate change is actually good. The temperature going up is actually great. She's like, actually, because of the carbon going up, we have increased food production, which is just like a flat out lie. Like the World Health Organization is like, if we don't get this under control, our food supply is fucked. And so it's just like this misinformation. And it is like, I don't understand how like Tracy providing all this science, all this back, like people are getting sick and nobody on, the other side of the aisle is like, we should be concerned about the health of people that are alive right now, of people that are wanting to have children come into this world, whatever. And they're focused on all these like weird issues about like forcing somebody to be pregnant who doesn't want to be pregnant. When it's like people are sick right now based on programs or companies that you're funding or providing the funding for and not providing regulation to stop.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. And then the other thing is just to think about how many ways this infects our lives, right? I mean, if you're a person that eats fast food, as Tracy talked about, there's a source. If you're a person that wears makeup, there's a source. If you're a person that doesn't do any of these things, you might still be going to your faucet and getting a glass of water, and there's your source. And how it really is something people can't protect themselves from. We have to have government step up and step in and control this situation and protect the people and protect our environment. And yet they are failing miserably.
Yeah, there's just like nothing to be said about it. And I feel like, there's especially these things where there's not an escape from it for anybody. Like the basic fact is every human being has to drink water to survive. That's it, point blank period. I don't care if you've bought the top market shelf Brita filter or whatever. At some point in your life, you're going to have to drink out of a faucet. You're going to have to drink out of a city water fountain. You're going to get water from somebody who doesn't filter their water, and you're probably going to ingest it. Or like, flossing your teeth. I like, it's just, or if you buy a raincoat, it probably has it on there, and there's runoff from that raincoat eventually. Like it comes out, the chemicals come out. So yeah, I like, you kind of summed it up best. Is government, and ton of Tracy too, like government needs to step up. And
yeah, so in my book, my upcoming edition of the book, right, in the Green Amendment, the first edition, I have a lot about PFAS and the PFAS story, and really some of what Tracy talked about the situation in Paulsboro with Solvay. But I go into it a little bit more in the second edition that's coming out in November, November 1. And, in this, I tell a variety of stories. And I'm just want to share with you some of what I uncovered in my research and part of the stories that I tell. So if it's okay, I just want to read a little bit of the book. There's a lot more about this. So Within a decade of using the substance, one of DuPont's scientists judged PFOA, that's one of the forms of PFAS, so dangerous that people had to handle it, quote, with extreme care, end quote. The company's in-house scientific studies linked the toxin to genetic mutation, organ malfunction, cancer, and death in animal subjects. In 1962, DuPont experimented with human subjects, asking study participants to smoke cigarettes laden with PFOA and report their symptoms. These subjects became acutely ill, suffering diarrhea, chills, and body pain. Over the decades, DuPont's factory workers also exhibited a variety of short and long-term health ailments. Colds were so prevalent among DuPont factory workers that the afflicted referred to their routine nausea, dizziness, chills, headaches, and fever symptoms as, quote, the Teflon flu, end quote. Just a little bit of what I write about more about this issue of PFAS and the forms it takes, the way it's used, and how it's almost beyond words, right? That these scientists would experiment. It's bad to experiment on the animals. And here also they're experimenting on the people. PFAS contaminated cigarettes? What a double whammy of harm.
Yeah, that's true. There's just no, like in the movie I mentioned too, The Devil We Know, there's a lot of there's at least one grown man whose mom was a DuPont worker in like the factory, exposed to like one of those first chemicals. I think it's called like 3C or 8C is the chemical specified in that. But it's a PFOA. And has deformities, and there's several other women who worked in this factory that had deformity, or whose children now have deformities or issues. And there's just like, there's absolutely zero claim that they didn't know this was going to be a problem, or that they didn't know the chemicals were bad for people. And that's super interesting. I feel like the fact too, like, let's call for human trials is like, oh, so you know you're being sus. You know something bad is going to happen. And then too, that it bothers me more that there's not this moral feeling in these people of like, oh shit, this is really bad for people. And I don't care how much money I make, I'm not going to pollute people's bodies. That's what gets me, honestly.
And the other thing is, it's, it's another observation I make later in the book about PFAS. I guess on some horrifyingly grotesque level, people expect that companies are going to be okay with devastating people's health and lives using chemicals like PFAS because they're making gobs of money, right? And we see it with fracking, right? We see it with all kinds of things, and PFAS is one. So you expect it from the companies, which you shouldn't, because they're people too, but okay. But the other thing that is so disturbing is that it wasn't just the companies, and isn't just the companies. It's also the military, the Department of Defense, who has known for decades about the devastating health consequences of PFAS on people. And yet through their actions, like Tracy talked about, the use of firefighting foams in their practices to put out fires and things, they use PFAS based fire retardants and directly expose their military people to the chemical. And often the chemical would just wash down the drain. And so directly put it into the environment and into the neighboring communities, including into surface waters and groundwaters that ultimately become drinking water supplies. So directly putting it into the drinking water of people. And yet the military, the Department of Defense, the government was okay with that, is okay with that. Can one say that's more disturbing than companies doing it for money? I don't know.
It's all disturbing. It's just all disturbing. Like there's not, yeah, I don't know. It's like, again, I hate these episodes because I don't have anything to say because I'm just like I'm at a loss of
Yeah.
words because I'm like, I don't, like the literal basis of all I can say is like, I don't fucking get it because I don't. I don't. There's no amount of money or something that you could be like, that's worth. Literally every person in the US has this in their blood.
But we can end the episode on an upswing. Doesn't necessarily have to be a positive note, but on an upswing. And really after all these decades of so many governments ignoring this, we are seeing some states step up, like, New Jersey, like Maine is starting to work on it. Now, yes, their hands are being forced because it's in drinking water. Maine, like, Tracy talked about the story in Vermont, Maine and New Mexico also have farms and farming that had to be shut down because of PFAS contamination. So loss of tremendous wealth for those farmers, right? Their tremendous income because they had to destroy their animals. They couldn't sell their animals. They couldn't sell their milk. There's stories of one farmer having to dump millions of gallons of milk. So not only did he lose his profits, but they talked about, how many children that could have provided milk to. So we have these farmers being hurt in Maine because of the PFAS on the farmlands and deer grazing on the farmlands. You now have deer with PFAS in their flesh. And now there are not just do not fish advisories, but there are do not hunt advisories in Maine for deer. So because of these kinds of realities and exposures, states are being forced to do something, but they are starting to do something. And the hot news of the week, which is really important, is that unlike his predecessor, the Trump administration that threw all science out the window and did anything and everything they could to thwart scientific analysis and science-based decision-making, the Biden administration has picked up the mantle of science, is doing science and starting to put it into action. And so maybe at the federal level, while it's not an enforceable regulation, which is what we need, we are starting to at least see the ball move with a health advisory limit that's no longer 70 PPT, but is at those minuscule levels that Tracy talked about. So that's a positive.
That is a positive. That's a good way to end this episode. So I think, but that PFAS are important. Well, they're bad, but important for you to pay attention to, find out what's going on with your state, find out if your state's getting involved. And yeah, and if you want to read more, you should go to the link that's below in the description that also gives a little pre-order link to the second edition of the Green Amendment book. I almost said the Second Amendment book. Second edition of the Green Amendment book. And with that, we will see you all next time.
See you next time. Oh, and don't forget, if you want to get active on PFAS, DelawareRiverkeeper.org. Big leader in the PFAS movement. So get the book, support the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, get involved in PFAS. You're all awesome.